Dr. Witte, thanks so much for joining us. Let's start with the basics. What exactly is basic science, and why is it the foundation in biomedical research?
Basic science is the foundation for biomedical research for the simple reason that you can't make any progress in any area of biomedical research without understanding how things work. And the goal of a basic scientist is to understand the biology of humans or animals or whatever test system you're looking at, and to apply that knowledge to try to develop either cures for specific diseases or better diagnostic tests, or to improve on existing drugs that might be available for a specific disease. But it's really taking the car apart, understanding how it works, and then trying to put it back together and improve it.
How does translational science build on discoveries in the lab to move ideas towards real world use?
Translation takes the knowledge from basic science and applies it into a clinical situation in a much more complicated kind of test than we do in the laboratory, because it has to be done in the clinic or hospital setting.
So, when we talk about clinical research, what does that actually involve? You spoke about that a little bit. How does it differ from the earlier phases of research?
Clinical research, and I'll use the area which I'm most familiar, which is cancer research and development of new cancer drugs, involves testing an idea for a therapeutic, usually in the clinical situation of a patient with a specific type of disease who's usually failed other therapies, and the cancer is progressing, and you want to try something new to learn about your new therapy, but also potential benefit for that patient who's entered into the clinical trial. As an experiment, it has to be compared with either existing therapy or an alternative new therapy that's being considered. And that's where the experimental part comes in. Can't guarantee the outcome of that. We're trying to learn what will work, how does it work in different patients, and if there are significant side effects or problems that we should be aware of, so that we can minimize those and provide the greatest benefit to a patient.
So, can you walk us through an example of a discovery that moved from basic science to clinical application?
Well, I'll give an example that connects back to my own work, and I can take it back even before I started working on this particular problem I'll tell you about, which is a type of leukemia called chronic myelogenous leukemia, for which a wonderful drug has been developed and is now being given to hundreds of thousands of patients worldwide, and with a wonderful effect. A drug called imatinib, or by its trade name, Gleevec, and relatives of that drug. The story starts actually back when I was in medical school. That's over 50 years ago, and was taking care of patients with this type of disease as part of my medical student training. And there was essentially very limited therapy to treat these patients. We could give them sort of standard chemotherapy, and then certain very complicated therapies like bone marrow transplantation. But most of the time it didn't work, and these patients would progress from diagnosis to death, usually within just a few years. After I left medical school and went on to do some training in postdoctoral training at MIT, I studied a group of viruses that caused cancer in mice, one of which called the Abelson murine leukemia virus. I understood the nature of its genetics and found a gene which bore the name of ABL, ABL. It's actually named after a pediatric hematologist named Herb Abelson, who discovered this virus some years earlier. The long and short of it, that this was just curiosity-driven research. How did this virus cause cancer? Well, it turns out that a single gene expressed by this virus was the cause of a certain type of leukemia in mice, and that leukemia, driven by that single gene, led to an understanding of this human leukemia some years later called chronic myelogenous leukemia, in which the same gene was activated and led to the causation of leukemia of this specific type in humans. All of that would be informative and useful, but what was most impressive is that this particular gene called APL was a member of a gene family called tyrosine kinases, which I was proud to participate in discovering, along with many other scientists. And this gene family now has a group of inhibitors, many of them turned into actual drugs, which can block the action of the tyrosine kinase. It's a lot of jargon, it's a lot of medical specificity, a lot of basic science, but the outcome is studying something because you were interested in knowing how it worked led to a direct connection with human disease and eventually produced through the pharmaceutical industry an inhibitor turned into a drug, which can literally stop the progression of this leukemia and allow patients to live for many, many decades with it.
It's such an incredible accomplishment. I love the curiosity-based research. That's just such a it's I get to do a lot of these interviews, and that seems like such a critical component to these big breakthroughs where you're
Well,
changing
that
the world.
the curiosity-driven research or basic research to understand how things work is where almost all major medical breakthroughs come from. And we think in the cancer field, you think about the advances such as the drugs that we call checkpoint inhibitors, which are now being given to patients with advanced melanoma, lung cancer, many other types of cancers, which activate the immune system to attack the tumor. Uh, Kinds of responses we're seeing with that class of drugs is unheard of 20 years ago. Okay. And now they're so routine that every major medical center has an infusion center where patients can line up in chairs and get intravenous infusion of these drugs and provide some hope for what was a previously hopeless set of situations. It's quite remarkable, quite
It's
dramatic.
it is so remarkable. And I just it's almost like technology, once the innovation is created, like people you just come to expect that this is the way it is. But for people who didn't know what that was like, it was such a different world. Right.
The best example, of course, is every time I pick up my cell phone and use it to do 100 different things in a day. I wondered, does anybody really know how much basic science had to go into the creation of the technical components for the phone, the enhancement of everything, including the camera function, the wonderful ability to be on the internet, text message, etc., all from a handheld device. Think back 20, 25 years, wasn't available. Same thing with basic science in the medical sciences, things that were discovered 25, 30, even 40 years ago. Some of them are just now coming into clinical practice because the development time is all, you don't see it, okay, but it's right in front of you.
It must be so amazing to be part of that and then see the world shift. The world really shifts. So why you spoke to this, but why is it important to have all three phases, basic, translational, and clinical, working together in the research ecosystem?
Well, it used to be that the basic science was done in medical schools or college research labs or research institutes associated with hospitals, and that information was published. And then people in the pharmaceutical industry could read it and be influenced by it, and perhaps take some of it forward. That's moderately efficient, okay, because everyone's job was to discover something new and take advantage of it. But it's so much more efficient when people who are doing the basic research are in direct contact with people who can do the translational research. And then with the support of pharmaceutical industry, biotechnology industry, take chances on some of those discoveries to try to develop them into drugs. It shortens the timeline to go from the scientific discovery to the potential drug, and it enhances the access of everybody, patients and their families, to these new medicines, to have them developed by teams of researchers that are working synergistically and continuously in the process.
So what typically happens if there's a gap in funding or support in any of those stages?
You can do some forms of science sitting at your computer, and you can do some forms in the laboratory. But what it takes are trained people, okay, with some vision and a lot of energy and desire to get it done. And that requires training those people, okay. Then it requires hiring those people in addition to build a team and working with people who have various specialties. Not every scientist does everything equally well. Some are trained for certain machine applications like working with DNA sequencing or mass spectrometry. Others are much better at the biology, working with cells and culture, and so on. There's 1,000 different technologies that need to be thought about. So by having teams of people working together, you get the range of technical approaches, and you get a much better outcome in terms of how long it takes to understand a problem, to make a breakthrough, to make a discovery. And that's what the money from the NIH or the NSF goes to, is to support those teams of people to put their highly trained individuals to work and come up with new knowledge that wasn't available before they did these experiments. And it's a great process when it works. You love it. You see the exciting scientific result. But I can tell you from a lot of personal experience, a number of times you think of something and you're pretty sure you know how it's going to work, and it turns out to be very, very different. And that's when it gets actually most exciting, is when you fail and then eventually succeed. You try things that doesn't work, try something else and it does. And that's when you know you have something exciting and potentially important that can turn into a new medicine.
And can you speak to a little bit about, each of those components, if any of them get a gap or have loss of funding, that it basically shuts the system down?
Absolutely. And the funding to turn a new idea into a new medicine, it gets more and more expensive as you get closer to the clinic. Basic science is relatively inexpensive compared to translational studies and then on into actual clinical trials, but they're so codependent on each other. For example, data you gather in an early attempt at a clinical trial, even if the clinical trial doesn't work, it can sometimes be incredibly instructive by learning why it didn't work, to go back to the basic science and to try to reiterate or improve on the discovery you made. And that's been the case many, many times in drug discovery. But you can't do the translational without having in a sense, the food to feed into the translational machine, which is the product of the basic science discoveries. And you can't do the translational without that, and you can't get onto the clinical without the translational component. So they are absolutely required, one component to the next, to make the system work.
So why is federal funding, like from NIH or NSF, critical for basic science research?
Federal funding is the vast majority of funding available to fuel the basic science discovery engine. There is no other source of funding that in solo or aggregate form comes close to what the federal government has been providing for this basic science research. I think the annual budget of National Institute of Health is around $50 billion. If you add up all of the other sources of funding from private agencies, charities, individuals, et cetera, I doubt it would come to more than 20% of that. If you look at all the sources available to universities and so on. There are some wonderful exceptions of major gifts that people give to universities to support science, but they mainly come in the forms of bricks and mortar, usually a new building or foundation sets up a long-term arrangement. Those are great, but they don't really compare in magnitude to the impact and size of funding from the NIH and the NSF. So any cuts in that funding, okay, are going to have a disproportionately large effect on slowing down the progress of science and the production of new medicines.
Can you talk about the role government funding plays in reducing the risk that private companies might not be willing to take on?
There's never a guarantee when a company tries to progress from someone's basic science observations and turn it into a drug, but they like to see enough study on the basic principle tested in various ways to say, it's not risk-free, but it's not completely a shot in the dark. And so I think government funding does two things. It provides the new ideas, and it provides at least initial proof of principle about what we're speaking of, so that people in positions in industry, whether it's biotechnology or large pharma companies, can say there's enough there that I'm willing to take a risk and apply my company's funding to turn that into a drug and test it in the clinic. And that's a big decision. And I don't minimize that decision for anybody in those positions. It's sometimes quite difficult to predict what's going to happen as you transition from basic science into translational and into the clinic.
Can you share a story where federally funded research led to a major medical breakthrough?
Oh, absolutely. Um, at the time, the work in my lab on the discovery of the gene target for the drug that would eventually be called Gleevec, or by its chemical name, imatinib, it was my lab was 100% funded by grants from the National Institutes of Health. Okay, paid for my graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, technical staff, supplies that we needed, et cetera. Every aspect of that discovery can be directly related to funding from the National Institutes of Health.
Can you talk about how, I mean, you spoke about this in respect to that specific case, but just talk a little bit more about how this kind of research affects everyday lives of Americans, even if they don't see what's happening, even if they don't know that science is going on.
There isn't a person on the planet whose life hasn't been affected in some way or another by the disease we generalize and call cancer. I've never met anybody who, when they're diagnosed with cancer or interact with members of their family, who started the conversation by saying they're a Democrat or a Republican. There is no politics to having cancer or having a family member have cancer. And so the involvement of all of us, okay, in seeing a new medicine come to treat one or another type of cancer is a very common and human experience. And what I think most people don't see is that when you're faced with that situation, it's the basic science research that was supported 10, 20, even 30 years earlier that may be coming forward to give you some hope, to give your family member hope that there's a new kind of drug, there's something we hadn't thought about, there's a new way of treating this disease. And so the commonality of that is what should bring people to supporting basic science, any of the cancers that we deal with now, much more effectively because of the basic science work that went into creating new medicines that are in use today.
So, if you could speak to the mRNA vaccine and how it really was a series of breakthroughs that led to that. So, it felt like a instant response or very quick response to the American people, but it was really a lot of research behind it.
The production of vaccines to fight the COVID epidemic was one of the most remarkable episodes in the application of basic science to an important or emerging clinical problem. The technologies that were used in the creation of those vaccines were long in the making. There was fundamental chemistry of RNA involved, creation of these specialized lipid structures to carry the messenger RNA into the cells of our body to be produced and then have a reactive immune response, which could provide protection of the virus. This all came over a series of studies in multiple groups, multiple years in the making. And then at the time of this international emergency, this epidemic, these vaccines could be produced very quickly at scale and also distributed at scale in a time frame that saved, I think, millions of lives around the world. And so it is a beautiful example of how importance of supporting basic science so that we're ready to respond to the next public health emergency or emerging disease with some basic knowledge of how things work and how we can apply them for new therapeutics. I think it's a great story and should be supported over and over again as an example of the impact of basic science on the lives of all of us.
What economic benefits come from federal investment in biomedical research in terms of jobs, innovation, or regional development?
The impact of the federal government's investment in science is calculated by economists and others as usually a very high return on investment. Now, I'm the last person to think I understand how you calculate that, but I can assure you that there's a lot of science that goes on that doesn't seem connected to anything practical, but turns out later to be highly important. As said, if you're thinking about the COVID vaccine, people working on the original methods to modify messenger RNA structure probably didn't have in mind the specific example of preparing a vaccine to protect you against this SARS-CoV-2 virus that emerged, seemingly overnight and spread around the world. But yet there it was. And so the investment is not just to calculate how many drugs came out, how many new treatments are available because of X dollars spent, but to say that we're ready, okay, to prepare these new drugs. We're there with the knowledge, okay? And the more of that knowledge we have, the more efficient we'll be at preparing these new therapies, whether it's in an emergency situation or a chronic situation, where, lung cancer is a perfect example. Over the decades, lung cancer was treated with surgery, radiation, standard chemotherapy, and the results were not particularly good. Now, with the advent of things like checkpoint inhibitors to stimulate the immune response, certain types of tyrosine kinase inhibitors that treat specific types of lung cancer with high efficiency, the death from lung cancer is slowing down and prolonged life expectancy following diagnosis. I don't know how you put a price tag on it, but I know if you have a relative or you yourself have this disease, I'd say the benefits of supporting basic research should be incalculable.
Why is now a critical moment for investing in biomedical research, especially with the rise of technologies like AI and gene editing?
I think the reason for investing is the most simple one. There's a good payoff, okay? We're seeing more and more of our research turn into very practical outcomes for our society. Better drugs for cancer, better drugs for infectious disease, better drugs to manipulate the immune system in the face of an increasing number of different autoimmune diseases that our world is faced with. And all of these technologies have sort of come together and can be used in different scenarios. And so now's not the time to pull back on the research. Now's the time to re-stimulate it, to increase the rate at which we can change these things. One person successfully treated for a otherwise deadly cancer changes that person's life forever, but it also changes their family's life, and it changes whatever occupation that person had, that they have more years of being both alive and productive. And as you begin to calculate this, each of these improvements in medical care connected back to a basic science set of experiments just says the investment in basic science is worth it at the human level as well as at the financial level.
If you could tell a member of Congress one thing about why continued funding is vital, what would it be?
Very simple. It's what I've told members of Congress in the past when I've gone to either testify or to subcommittees and so on, is that the investment that they make in science is an investment for the American public to receive better health care, okay, and better outcomes for the disease that plagues their constituents. Okay? And that's the responsibility they have, is to recognize that science is good for the American people and good for their constituents, and that it's got nothing to do with political party. It has to do with common sense.
How can listeners get involved to help protect and expand federal funding for science and health innovation?
Vote for people who support science is the easiest answer. But also there's any number of public information groups and public access groups that support science at a general level or disease-specific level. And the more people who get involved with that, I think the better it is for all of us, and certainly for the support of science and science into medicine.
Thank you so much for your time. This was fantastic.
My pleasure.